The graduation ceremony was going perfectly until Principal Eleanor Whitmore stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes locked on the back of the room, where a man in a faded button-down shirt stood quietly beside a column, completely out of place among the tailored suits and pressed blazers. The entire hall began turning to look. Then Eleanor stepped down from the stage, something no one had ever seen her do, and walked straight toward him, her face stripped of every professional composure she had spent decades building. Nobody understood why. Nobody knew who he was. Caleb Hayes had learned a long time ago how to make himself invisible in rooms where he didn't belong. It wasn't a skill he practiced. It was something that had simply grown into him over the years, like scar tissue, quiet, functional, and mostly painless, until someone pressed on it directly. He knew how to stand near a wall without drawing attention, how to keep his expression neutral when people glanced over and made their silent assessments. He had gotten very good at it. Too good, probably. He had come straight from work. There hadn't been time to go home and change, not if he wanted to make it before the ceremony started. His shift at the repair shop had run late, a circuit board replacement that turned into a full diagnostic, then a customer who couldn't decide what they actually wanted. And by the time he locked up and drove the 40 minutes to Westbridge, the parking lot was already filling with cars that cost more than he made in 2 years. He sat in his truck for a moment before getting out. His shirt was clean. That was the most he could say for it. The Westbridge Institute for Advanced Studies sat at the edge of a private campus that felt designed to remind visitors of their place. The buildings were old and deliberate, red brick white columns, iron fencing along the perimeter, the kind of architecture that communicated permanence without saying a word. Caleb had walked these paths before. A long time ago he had walked them every day. But that version of himself felt like a different person entirely. Someone he had read about once and couldn't fully picture anymore. He found his way into the main hall without being stopped, though one usher near the entrance looked at him the way people looked at things that seemed out of place. A quick scan, a small frown, a decision not to engage. Caleb kept moving. He wasn't there to be comfortable. He was there because Lucas was graduating, and that was the only thing that mattered today. The hall was already packed. Rows of chairs filled the center floor, most of them taken by graduates in their gowns and by families dressed for the occasion. The women wore dresses. The men wore suits, dark, well-fitted, the kind that didn't come off a clearance rack. There were flowers everywhere, and the low, warm sound of an organ playing softly over the crowd noise. Caleb moved along the side aisle toward the back, where a few empty spaces remained near the wall columns. He found a spot, leaned his shoulder against the stone, and scanned the rows of graduates until he spotted Lucas. Lucas was in the third row from the front, his dark gown pressed, and neat, his posture straight in the way that suggested he'd been thinking about this day for a long time. He was talking quietly to the person beside him, gesturing with his hands, the way he always did when he was explaining something he cared about. Caleb watched him and felt something settle in his chest, not quite pride, or not only pride. It was something older and quieter, the feeling of having carried something heavy for a very long time, and finally being allowed to set it down. He didn't try to get Lucas's attention. He didn't wave or call out. He just stood there and watched, which was what he had come to do. The ceremony opened with remarks from a faculty member Caleb didn't recognize, followed by a student speaker who talked about persistence and vision in the way that people talk about those things when they are young enough to believe they haven't been tested yet. The words were fine. Caleb listened without really hearing his eyes moving between Lucas and the stage keeping track of the program unfolding in front of him. Then, Principal Eleanor Whitmore stepped to the podium. Caleb recognized her immediately, though he hadn't expected to feel anything when he saw her. She was older than he remembered, her hair fully silver now, her posture more deliberate, carrying the particular gravity of someone who had spent decades in authority. She had been younger when he was a student. Here, a professor still working her way toward administration, sharp-edged and exacting in the way that either broke students or made them better. For Caleb, she had been the latter. She had been the one who first told him without any softness in her voice that the work he was doing wasn't just good, it was significant, and he needed to understand the difference. He hadn't thought about that conversation in years. He watched her adjust the microphone and set her notes on the podium, and he told himself it didn't matter. It was a long time ago. He was here for Lucas. Eleanor began her address. She spoke clearly, and with the practiced confidence of someone who had given this speech many times and knew exactly how to calibrate it, when to let the words breathe, when to push forward, when to let a sentence land. The crowd listened. Caleb listened. He had almost let himself relax into the background the way he was meant to when her eyes moved across the room in the natural sweep of a speaker, taking in her audience, and then stopped. They stopped on him. He saw it happen. The slight change in her face, not dramatic, not a gasp or a visible shock, but a stillness that spread from her eyes downward, a kind of internal brake being applied at high speed. She was still standing at the podium. Her hands were still resting on her notes. But for a span of several seconds, the words simply stopped coming, and the hall, which had been quietly attentive, became something else. Uncertain, curious, beginning to stir. Eleanor looked at him the way someone looks at a name they haven't thought of in 15 years, suddenly appearing on a page in front of them. Like recognition and disbelief, arriving at the same moment, and neither one winning immediately. Caleb didn't move. He stood exactly where he was beside the column at the back of the room, and held her gaze because looking away felt somehow wrong. Around him, heads had already started turning, people in the audience, following the direction of the principal's attention, trying to locate whatever had caused this unusual silence in the middle of what was supposed to be a composed, formal address. Then Eleanor stepped away from the podium. She didn't announce what she was doing. She didn't hand her notes to anyone or signal to the faculty seated on stage. She simply stepped down from the platform and began walking through the hall toward the back of the room, her pace steady and purposeful in a way that made the silence around her complete. Every eye followed her. The graduates twisted in their seats. The parents craned their necks. The faculty on stage exchanged glances that did nothing to explain what was happening. Caleb watched her come. He considered briefly stepping back or finding some way to make this easier to reduce the spectacle of it. But there was nowhere to go, and something in the way she was moving told him that wouldn't help anyway. So he stayed where he was, his shoulder against the column, his hands loose at his sides, and waited. Eleanor stopped in front of him. She was close enough that he could see the details of her face clearly, the lines that hadn't been there before, the composure that was still mostly intact, but had a fracture running through it that she wasn't trying very hard to hide. She looked at him for a long moment without saying anything, the kind of look that wasn't searching for information so much as confirming something she had already suspected. "Caleb Hayes," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that only the people nearest to them could have heard it, but the hall was so silent by then that it carried anyway. He nodded once. "Principal Whitmore." She let out a short breath through her nose, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between. "You're here for Lucas," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's graduating today," Caleb said. "I wasn't going to miss it." She looked at him for another moment, taking in the faded shirt, the shadows under his eyes, that spoke to a night shift, recently finished, the stillness in him that she seemed to be measuring against something she remembered. Then something in her expression shifted not into pity, which Caleb would have recognized, and closed himself against, but into something more complicated. A kind of weight that she seemed to be deciding whether to carry or set down. "You should have told me you were coming," she said. "I didn't think it was necessary," he said. "I'm just here to watch." She held his gaze a second longer, then turned back toward the stage. The hall remained still as she walked back to the podium, and the silence held until she reached it and placed both hands on the edge of the lectern and looked out at the audience with the steady, unreadable expression of someone who has just made a decision they intend to stand behind. Then she continued her address as if nothing had happened. But the room had already changed. The people nearest the back column had seen enough to start talking in low voices, leaning toward each other with questions they couldn't answer. Further up the hall, people were still craning their necks, trying to identify the man Eleanor Whitmore had walked across the room to speak to. Lucas, from his seat in the third row, had turned around like everyone else, and when his eyes found Caleb at the back of the hall, he looked at him with an expression Caleb couldn't fully read from that distance, something between confusion and a question he hadn't formed yet. Caleb gave him a small nod. Lucas turned back around. The ceremony continued. Names were called. Graduates crossed the stage to receive their diplomas. The organ played transitional music between sections of the program, and the audience applauded at the appropriate moments. Caleb watched all of it from his position at the back wall, and if anyone near him tried to ask who he was or what had just happened, he gave them nothing. Not rudely, but firmly, with the ease of someone who had been deflecting questions about himself for a very long time. When they called Lucas Hayes, Caleb straightened slightly. He watched his brother walk across the stage with the particular confidence of someone who had worked hard for this, and knew it, who accepted his diploma with a firm handshake, and turned to face the audience for the requisite moment before stepping back down. Lucas didn't look for him this time. He kept his chin up his face, composed, doing exactly what the moment required of him. Caleb thought this is why. Not as a conscious thought, not in those words exactly, but as something in the body, a loosening in the shoulders, a breath taken more fully than usual. This is why all of it was worth it. The early mornings, the late nights, the years of choosing Lucas's future over his own without letting himself think too hard about what that meant. It was worth it. He was certain of that. He was less certain about the way Eleanor Whitmore had looked at him when she walked across that hall. He was less certain about what she had seen on his face that had made her stop mid-sentence in front of an audience of several hundred people and abandon the distance she had clearly maintained for the length of an entire career. That part of the afternoon he didn't have an explanation for yet. He filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things he wasn't ready to look at directly, and he went back to watching the ceremony. The graduation ended with a final address and a round of applause that filled the hall and then spilled out into the corridor as people began to rise from their seats and find each other. Caleb stayed where he was until the initial surge of movement passed, then pushed off from the column and began making his way toward where Lucas would likely emerge from the graduate section. He moved along the wall unhurried, keeping out of the main flow of traffic. He didn't get far before he noticed the change in the room around him, the way the conversations near him seemed to slow slightly, the way eyes tracked him with a recognition he hadn't earned and didn't understand. He heard his name once spoken by someone he didn't recognize in a tone that suggested they were answering a question rather than asking one. He kept moving. He found Lucas near the side exit gown, still on diploma case in hand, talking to another graduate. When Lucas saw him coming, he said something brief to the other person and stepped forward, and Caleb prepared himself for the congratulations, for the uncomplicated happiness that this day was supposed to deliver to both of them. But Lucas wasn't looking at him with uncomplicated happiness. He was looking at him with that same half-formed question from earlier, the one that had sharpened considerably in the time since the ceremony ended. "What was that?" Lucas said. His voice was low, meant only for Caleb. "She recognized me," Caleb said simply. "We knew each other when I was a student here." Lucas looked at him steadily. He had his mother's patience when he wanted to use it, which meant he was perfectly capable of standing in place and waiting for more without saying a word. Caleb had always found that quality both admirable and difficult to deal with. "You were a student here," Lucas said. "For a while," Caleb said. "A long time ago." He said it the way he said everything about that period evenly, without emphasis in the tone of someone reporting a fact that belonged to the past and intended to stay there. Lucas looked at him for a moment that stretched just past comfortable, and Caleb held it without flinching, the way he had held many things without flinching over the years. Then Lucas looked away and let it go, at least for now. The crowd moved around them, voices rising in the corridor as families found each other, and the formal afternoon dissolved into the relaxed noise of a celebration concluding. Caleb stood with his brother in the middle of it, all the diploma case between them, the unanswered question floating in the air like something neither of them was quite ready to reach for yet. Around them, people were still talking, and somewhere in the back of the hall, a few of the older faculty members had begun to look at each other with the specific expression of people who had just witnessed something they thought they understood and were still deciding what to do about it. The reception was held in the courtyard adjacent to the main hall, long tables covered in white linen catered refreshments, faculty moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of people who had done this many times. It was the kind of event designed to feel celebratory, without requiring anyone to feel anything too specifically. Caleb stood near the edge of it, with Lucas, who had taken off his graduation gown and folded it over one arm, and they talked about small things that drive. The weather, whether Lucas was hungry, the way people talk when there is a larger conversation waiting just behind the ordinary one. He noticed the looks before Lucas did. They came from across the courtyard, from clusters of older faculty members gathered near the far side of the refreshment tables, people in their 50s and 60s, whose faces carried the particular alertness of recognition being processed. They weren't staring. They were too composed for that. But their eyes returned to him more than once, and twice he caught the specific gesture of someone leaning toward the person next to them to say something that required lowering the voice. Lucas noticed eventually. He had always been observant in ways he didn't always announce. He said nothing about it immediately, but Caleb saw the moment it registered a slight shift in how Lucas held himself, a new quality of attention directed outward rather than inward. One of the faculty members broke from his group and approached with the deliberate movement of someone who had decided to act before he talked himself out of it. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with white hair and the kind of face that had settled comfortably into its age. Caleb recognized him a half-second before the man reached them, Professor Gerald Marsh, who had taught advanced differential equations when Caleb was a second-year student and had a reputation for being genuinely difficult to impress. Gerald Marsh extended his hand. "I wasn't sure at first," he said. "But it's you, Caleb Hayes." "Professor Marsh," Caleb said, and shook the hand. "You haven't changed much," Marsh said, which was probably not entirely true, but was the kind of thing people said. He glanced at Lucas, then back to Caleb, making the connection without needing it explained. "Your brother just graduated." "He did," Caleb said. Marsh looked at him with the same weight Caleb had seen in Eleanor's face earlier. Not pity, but something more complicated, the expression of someone who understood the distance between where a person ended up and where they might have gone. "We used to talk about you, you know, in the department, for years after you left." He said it quietly, not unkindly. "The proof you completed in your third year. We still use it in the graduate seminar. The students don't know the name behind it, but the work is still there." Caleb said nothing. There wasn't a good response to that, so he didn't try to manufacture one. Lucas had gone very still beside him. Marsh seemed to sense that he had landed somewhere tender, and with the grace of a man who had spent decades reading rooms, he offered a few more polite words and excused himself back to his group. Caleb watched him go, and then became aware with a familiar settling feeling in his gut that the conversation he had been managing around the edges all afternoon was about to stop being manageable. "The proof you completed in your third year," Lucas said. He repeated it the way someone repeats a phrase when they need to hear it again to believe it. "It was a long time ago," Caleb said. "You were here for 3 years," Lucas said. "You told me you took some college courses. You said it didn't work out." "That's not inaccurate," Caleb said. Lucas looked at him with an expression that wasn't anger exactly, but had the structure of it, the tight line of the jaw, the eyes that were working harder than usual. "That's also not the whole story," he said. Caleb didn't have a response ready for that, which was unusual. He was very good at having responses ready. He had spent years building them, constructing the version of the past that was technically honest and practically livable. The version that allowed him to function without having to explain things that didn't change anything about the present. But standing in this particular courtyard, on this particular afternoon, with Gerald Marsh walking back to a group of people who had apparently spent years discussing his unfinished work, the architecture of that version felt less solid than it usually did. He was still deciding what to say when Eleanor Whitmore appeared. She came from the direction of the main building, and she came with purpose, not hurrying, but also not the pace of someone simply moving through a social event. She had a faculty member beside her, whom she dismissed with a few quiet words before she reached them. And then it was just her, and Caleb, and Lucas, in a small clearing in the middle of the reception, while the rest of the courtyard continued around them and pretended not to watch. Eleanor looked at both of them, then settled her attention on the space between them as if she was addressing the situation rather than either person individually. "I owe you an explanation," she said to Caleb, "for what happened on stage." "You don't," he said. "I think I do," she said, "and I think your brother deserves to hear it." Caleb could have stopped it there. He knew how to stop things, how to say the right words in the right tone that closed a door without slamming it. But Lucas was standing beside him with that expression still on his face, the one that said he was done accepting the abbreviated version of things, and somewhere in Caleb, the will to maintain the story he had been telling for 15 years simply gave way. He didn't speak. He didn't give Eleanor permission exactly. He just didn't stop her. Eleanor turned slightly so that she was addressing both of them, though the courtyard had quieted somewhat around them, and more than a few people had stopped pretending not to listen. She spoke clearly with no performance in it, only the directness of someone who had made a choice and intended to see it through. She said that in 30 years of education, she had encountered perhaps a handful of students whose relationship with mathematics was something other than intelligence applied to problems. Students for whom the field was something more like a language they had been born already knowing. Caleb Hayes, she said, had been one of them. Not the most diligent, not the most disciplined, but the most naturally connected to the work at a level that most people in the field spent entire careers trying to reach and never did. She said that in his third year, when most graduate track students were still building toward independent research, Caleb had completed a proof that 3 faculty members, herself included, had been working around for several years. He had not announced it. He had left it in a submission folder for his advisor's review, the way someone leaves a note on a kitchen table. His advisor had called her at 7 in the morning. The courtyard had gone fairly quiet now. Eleanor didn't acknowledge the audience. She kept her eyes on Caleb and on Lucas. She said that the following month, Caleb had been offered a place in an international research fellowship, a 2-year program based abroad, fully funded, the kind of opportunity that came to maybe 1 or 2 people in the entire country in a given year. She said she had sat across from him in her office and told him it was the most important thing he would ever be offered, and she had meant it. She still meant it. Caleb said nothing. He was looking at a point somewhere past Eleanor's shoulder, his face holding the particular flatness of someone managing a very large internal pressure by holding everything external completely still. Eleanor said that 2 weeks after the offer was made, Caleb had come back to her office and told her he was leaving Westbridge, that his parents had died, that his younger brother needed someone, and that he was that person. He had said it plainly without looking for her sympathy or her understanding. In the same tone she imagined he used to report everything that cost him something significant evenly, without emphasis, as if the feeling behind it was beside the point. She had tried to find alternatives, a deferral, a modified arrangement, some way to hold the door open while he did what he needed to do. He had declined all of it. He said he didn't know how long it would take, and he couldn't make promises on that kind of timeline, and he needed to be honest about that. Then he had thanked her for the opportunity and left. He didn't fail out, Eleanor said, and now she was looking at the broader space around them, at the people who had gathered, without fully meaning to. He didn't lose his way. He walked away from the most significant open door in his field, because someone needed him more than mathematics did, and he made that choice without drama, and without asking anyone to honor him for it. She looked back at Caleb. I should have found a better way to help you then. I've thought about that more than once over the years. You tried, Caleb said. His voice was even. I made my choice. The courtyard was quiet enough now that the words carried. Around them, the afternoon had changed shape, the easy celebration of an hour ago, replaced by something more weighted, more attentive. People were looking at Caleb differently than they had when he arrived, which he had been afraid of, which was partly why he had spent 15 years making sure he was never in rooms where this kind of looking could happen. Lucas had not moved. He was standing with his graduation gown still folded over his arm and his diploma case in his hand, and he was looking at his brother with an expression that had moved past the tight-jawed question of earlier and arrived somewhere else entirely. Somewhere quieter and more exposed, the face of someone who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand. Caleb looked at him once briefly and then looked away. He had not wanted this. He had specifically not wanted this. The subtle shift of mood that followed was strange to exist inside. People returned to their conversations, but they were different conversations now, conducted in lower voices, with more frequent glances toward the corner of the courtyard where Caleb stood. A few of the older faculty approached to say things, brief, careful things, the kind said when people are aware they are stepping into someone else's private history and aren't sure how far they're allowed to go. Caleb received them politely and said very little, which was the only way he knew how to be in situations like this. Lucas drifted away at some point, and Caleb let him. He understood that Lucas needed space to do whatever he was doing with the information that had just rearranged itself in front of him. They had always given each other room like that, even when the silences between them were difficult. It was one of the things that worked between them. But when Caleb looked for Lucas 20 minutes later, he found him standing alone near the courtyard wall, with his back to the reception, not talking to anyone, staring at the middle distance, with the expression of a person engaged in an argument with himself that he wasn't winning. Caleb moved toward him and stopped a short distance away, close enough to be reached, if Lucas wanted to reach him, far enough to let him decide. You gave up the fellowship, Lucas said without turning around. Yes, Caleb said, because of me. Because it was the right thing to do at the time, Caleb said carefully. Those aren't the same thing. Lucas turned around. His face was controlled in the way their father's face used to get controlled when he was feeling something large. The jaw set the eyes doing more work than the rest of the expression. Don't do that, he said. Don't make it sound like it wasn't about me. I'm not saying it wasn't about you, Caleb said. I'm saying the choice was mine. I made it. It was the right one. It cost you everything, Lucas said. It cost me one thing, Caleb said. One specific thing. I've had other things since then. Lucas shook his head. Not in disagreement exactly, but in the way someone shakes their head when they feel the ground shifting under a belief they've held for a long time. He had believed all these years a version of his own story that placed Caleb comfortably in the role of older brother, steady and capable someone who had settled into the life he had always been going to have. He had not known he was standing on top of something Caleb had buried to give him room to grow. I spent every year at this school thinking you were proud of me, Lucas said. I didn't know you should have been here too. I am proud of you, Caleb said. Those two things are not in conflict. The tension between them didn't dissolve it. settled, which was different. It became the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of things that both people know are there, and neither is quite ready to put into final words. They stood by the courtyard wall while the reception moved around them, and the afternoon light flattened toward early evening, and Caleb thought about how strange it was to be the person he was in this exact moment, standing on the grounds of the place he had left behind, holding his own history in both hands without having chosen to pick it up. Then he heard Eleanor's voice from behind him, and the afternoon shifted again. "Caleb." She waited until he turned. She was holding a manila envelope, which she had not been holding before, and her expression had the quality of someone who had made another decision and was equally committed to seeing this one through. "There's something I've been meaning to do for a long time," she said. "I should have done it sooner. I kept telling myself there was no point. But then you walked in today, and I realized that was never the real reason I was waiting." She held the envelope toward him. He took it without opening it. "Your research," she said. "The work you started before you left. The department archived it. We never published it under anyone else's name, never built on it without credit, and never threw it away. It's been sitting in a file in my office for 15 years. She let a moment pass. "And I'd like to formally ask you to consider coming back to Westbridge, not as a student, as a research faculty member, to finish what you started." The words landed in the middle of everything else that had happened today, and simply sat there, too large and too specific, to deflect the way he had deflected everything else. Caleb looked down at the envelope in his hands. He could feel the weight of it, which was slight. Just paper inside paper, but felt heavier than the physical object accounted for. 15 years was in there. The version of himself he had decided to stop being was in there pressed between pages of mathematical notation in his own handwriting, exactly as he had left it. He didn't open it. He just stood there, holding it while the evening settled in around the courtyard, and Lucas watched him from a few feet away with an expression that was no longer a question, but was not yet an answer either. And Caleb Hayes faced the thing he had spent 15 years making sure he was never in a room quiet enough to hear. He drove home alone that night, with the envelope on the passenger seat. He hadn't opened it at the reception. He hadn't opened it in the parking lot afterward, when Lucas had walked him to his truck, and they had stood in the cooling evening air saying goodbye, with the careful politeness of two people who both knew there was more to say and had silently agreed to say it later. He hadn't opened it on the highway, or when he stopped for gas 40 minutes outside the city, or when he finally pulled into the narrow driveway beside his house in the small town where he had spent the last 15 years becoming the person he currently was. He carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table, and then walked to the other side of the room and stood with his back to it. The house was quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet late at night, when there's no one else in them, not peaceful exactly, but honest. No performance required. Caleb had always preferred that quality of silence to the social kind, the kind you had to manufacture in front of other people by keeping your face arranged correctly and your answers short. Here, he didn't have to arrange anything. He could just stand in his kitchen with the envelope behind him and let himself feel whatever was actually there. What was actually there was harder to name than he expected. He had thought it would be grief, the clean, recognizable kind that comes from finally looking directly at something you've been managing sideways for years. But it wasn't quite that. It was more like the feeling of standing in a room you used to know very well and realizing that the furniture has been rearranged so many times in your absence that you no longer trust your own memory of how it used to look. He wasn't sure, standing in his kitchen at almost midnight, how much of what he had buried 15 years ago was loss, and how much of it was simply a life that had gone in a direction he hadn't chosen, and had chosen anyway. He turned around and looked at the envelope. He had made the decision he made because it was the only decision available to a person who was actually paying attention to what was in front of him. His parents were gone. Lucas was 20 years old, studying at a school that cost money Caleb could produce only if he stopped studying and started working, And Lucas was the kind of person who would quietly collapse under the weight of that situation if no one propped him up. Caleb had known that. He had made his calculations the same way he made every calculation thoroughly, without sentimentality following the logic wherever it went, and the logic had gone to Lucas. It had not felt like sacrifice at the time. It had felt like arithmetic. The part he hadn't calculated correctly was what happened after. How the years would accumulate around the decision until the decision became the foundation of everything, until the version of himself that existed before it started to feel less like a former self and more like a story someone else had told him about a person he'd never met. He hadn't expected to lose the thread of that person so completely. He had expected to set things aside temporarily and pick them back up. That was not what had happened. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put his hands on either side of the envelope without picking it up and looked at his own handwriting on the label. His name, the date, the title of the research project, all in the careful print of a 22-year-old who had believed neatness mattered because the work inside was going somewhere important. He recognized the handwriting, the way you recognize a photograph of yourself from a long time ago, certain it's you, uncertain about the distance. He was still sitting there when his phone lit up with Lucas's name. He answered it. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of communication between people who had known each other long enough to understand the grammar of silence. "You're not going to sleep," Lucas said. It wasn't a question. "No," Caleb said. Lucas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the texture of someone who had spent the drive home deciding exactly what he wanted to say and had arrived at it. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it instead of filing it away and moving on. Can you do that?" "I can try," Caleb said. "Everything I am right now, the degree, the work I did at Westbridge, the fact that I had a place to land after Mom and Dad, that's because of you," Lucas said. "I'm not saying that to make you feel good. I'm saying it because it's true, and I never said it directly, and I should have. You held everything together. I knew it on some level. I just didn't know how much you had let go of to do it. You were 20, Caleb said. You weren't supposed to know." "I'm not 20 now," Lucas said. Caleb didn't answer that. "Here's the thing," Lucas said. "The part that I keep coming back to on the drive home. You taught me for as long as I can remember that you don't walk away from work that matters. That you finish what you start. That the only real failure is stopping when you still have something left to give." He let that sit for a moment. "You taught me that, and then you spent 15 years not applying it to yourself." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, and its headlights swept briefly through the window above the sink. "I stopped because I had to," Caleb said. "You stopped because you had to," Lucas said. "That was then. What's the reason now?" Caleb had no answer for that. He had always had answers, had built his entire adult life on the capacity to produce a reasonable answer for any situation that required one. The absence of one now was strange enough that he felt it physically, a small hollow opening somewhere in the middle of his chest that the usual responses weren't filling. "I don't know who I am in that building anymore," he said finally. It came out more honestly than he intended, stripped of the management he usually applied to things like this. "You're the person who solved a problem that 3 professors couldn't," Lucas said. "You're the person whose work is still being taught there. You're the person Eleanor Whitmore crossed a room full of people to speak to because she recognized you immediately 15 years later in a faded shirt after one look." He said it without heat, simply, and directly, the way Caleb had always told him to say things that were true. "The building hasn't changed what you are. You just stopped letting yourself know it. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It had a different weight, not the weight of avoidance, but of something being set down." Caleb sat with it and didn't try to fill it or move past it. He let it be exactly what it was. "The envelope is on the table," he said. "Open it," Lucas said. He did. The pages inside were exactly what he had known they would be, and somehow nothing like what he had prepared himself for. His own handwriting filled the margins of printed sheets, notes layered over notes in the compressed associative shorthand of someone thinking faster than they can write cleanly. The central proof was there, complete the one Gerald Marsh had mentioned in the courtyard, but behind it were the beginning pages of the next thing, the extension he had started drafting in the 2 weeks between receiving the fellowship offer and making his decision, when some part of him had tried to hold both futures in his head at once before he understood that he couldn't. He remembered the specific morning he had put the pen down and not picked it back up. He remembered the quality of the light in his apartment, the temperature of the coffee he had stopped drinking. He hadn't known Eleanor had kept all of it. He had assumed the unfinished pages were discarded, too incomplete to archive, too preliminary to constitute anything. But they were here in the same order. He had left them with a paper clip where the work had stopped. Someone had kept them deliberately. Someone had understood that they meant something, even incomplete. He sat at the kitchen table until almost 2 a.m, reading pages he had written half a lifetime ago, and he did not feel what he had expected to feel, which was pain or grief or the specific ache of irreversible loss. What he felt instead was something more confusing and more honest, the recognition that the person who had written these pages was not entirely gone. Buried, yes. Redirected. Reshaped by 15 years of smaller urgencies and quieter demands. But not gone. The thinking was still there in him. He could feel it as he read, like a muscle that had gone unused for a very long time and was sore from the first movement, but still fundamentally intact. He closed the envelope at 2:15 and went to bed. In the morning, he called Eleanor Whitmore. He told her he would take the position on 3 conditions: that he be allowed to set his own pace for the return to research, that his teaching load remain manageable while he rebuilt his footing in the field, and that the work continue under his name without institutional claim over the direction it took. Eleanor agreed to all 3 without negotiating. She had the tone of someone who had thought through every possible response in advance and found that agreement was the correct one. "When can you start?" she asked. "Give me a month," he said. "I need to put things in order." "Take 6 weeks," she said. And Caleb, welcome back. He set the phone down on the table next to the envelope and sat for a moment in his kitchen in the flat morning light. He waited to see if he felt relief or excitement, or the particular warmth of a door reopening. What he felt was mostly quieter than that, a settling the same word he kept returning to, the feeling of something finding its correct position after a long time of being placed slightly wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself, but it was real, and it was his, and that was enough. The 6 weeks passed in the way that significant transitions often pass, not smoothly or cleanly, but in layers, one thing at a time, each small decision accumulating into a direction. He handed off his repair clients. He arranged for his tutoring students to continue with another instructor he trusted. He drove back to Westbridge twice before his start date, once to complete the paperwork, once to meet the faculty members he'd be working alongside, people who were largely younger than him and received him without the weight of history that the older generation carried into every interaction. He liked that about them. They knew his work, but not his story, which meant they engaged with the mathematics rather than the mythology, and that was exactly the kind of engagement he needed to find his way back in. His office was small and south-facing, with a window that looked out over the same iron fence he had walked past as a student. He set the envelope on the desk on his first day, and didn't open it again immediately. He just let it be there, present in the room, the way a thing can be present when you are no longer afraid of it. He started teaching 6 weeks after that, a mid-level course in real analysis, nothing that would strain him away back into the rhythm of standing in front of students and finding the words that made difficult things navigable. He had expected it to feel strange to require some performance of authority he didn't naturally possess. What surprised him was how quickly it came back. Not exactly as it had been, because he was not exactly who he had been, but in a form that fit who he was, now better than he had anticipated. He had spent 15 years explaining things to people. He had been doing it on a smaller stage, but the fundamental act was the same. He had been teaching for 3 weeks when Lucas showed up. Caleb was at the board when he saw him standing at the back of the lecture hall in the same easy stance Caleb recognized from years of watching him enter rooms, hands in his pockets, face open. He had taken a seat in the last row, which was mostly empty, and he was watching the front of the room with an expression that Caleb caught only briefly because he was in the middle of a lecture and couldn't afford to stop. He turned back to the board and continued. He finished the lecture, answered the questions that followed, waited while the students filed out. When the hall was empty, except for the 2 of them, Lucas came down from the back row. "You didn't tell me you were coming," Caleb said. "I wanted to see it," Lucas said simply. He stopped a few feet away and looked at his brother, the way you look at something you have thought about for a long time and are finally seeing clearly. "You're good at this," he said. "You're really good at this." "I'm getting back to it," Caleb said. "No," Lucas said with the certainty of someone who had just watched an hour of evidence. "You're good at it. Those aren't the same thing." It was Caleb realized exactly the distinction he had made about himself to Eleanor 15 years ago in her office. The difference between competence and something that lived deeper than competence. He had said it then about his mathematics. Lucas was saying it now about him. The symmetry of it landed in him quietly and stayed. He walked Lucas out of the building and across the campus, past the red brick and the white columns, and the iron fence that had once represented a version of his future that he had believed was sealed off permanently. The afternoon was cool and bright, the kind of clear autumn day that makes everything look exactly like itself, without softening or exaggeration. They walked without hurrying, talking in the way they could now, more directly, with less managed around the edges. The silence between words being what silence actually was, rather than a place to store the things that couldn't be said. At the gate, Lucas stopped. "You told me once that the only work worth doing is the work that costs you something," he said. "I remember," Caleb said. "I think you've been paying the cost for a long time," Lucas said. "I think it's okay to let it start paying you back." Caleb looked at him for a moment, at his brother, who had grown into someone whose thinking he genuinely respected, who had sat in the back row of his lecture hall on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, for no reason other than to see him, who was standing at the gate of Westbridge, telling him things that were true in the plain, unadorned way that true things needed to be told. He nodded once. "Go home," he said. "I have work to do." Lucas smiled at that, a real one without any of the weight of the past weeks in it, and turned to go. Caleb watched him walk away, then turned back toward the building. He had work to do. That was the whole of it. Not redemption, not a dramatic reversal, not the recovery of something lost. Just work the kind that had always been there, waiting with the specific patience of things that know their own value and do not require you to rush back to them. He walked back through the gate and across the courtyard and up the stairs to his south-facing office, where the envelope sat on the desk, exactly where he had left it, and he sat down and opened it and began. There are people who give up their dreams so quietly that no one around them ever fully understands the scale of what they put down. They don't announce it. They don't ask to be honored for it. They simply do what the moment requires, and then keep moving because the alternative is standing still. And standing still was never really an option. Healing for people like that doesn't look like getting back everything they lost. It looks like the morning they stop measuring the distance between where they are and where they might have been, and start putting their hands on the work in front of them, and decide simply without ceremony that they are allowed to be here too.